as she started singing, and I just got to thinking about, man, the times I've experienced the Lord and Him just do something for me. And I hope that what she was singing about resonates with you also, man. Because as I was just sitting there, I was thinking about some times where God had just done something to let me know that He was listening, let me know that He was involved in the situation. And I know it's real easy for us to get distracted, and sometimes you feel like, man, why would God even waste His time answering another prayer for me? And sometimes you pray over things and you seem silly. You think, man, in the grand scheme of things, literally the world's falling apart. And here you are praying about your little problem. And you think, why in the world would God answer your prayer? And then He does it anyway. And so I'm grateful that I have a God that answers even the small prayers. And He's interested in the small things. And so if you got your Bible, you can turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter number 12 is where we'll get started at tonight. I'm guilty of when I'm preaching somewhere, a lot of times I'll just dive right into it and not really not make no conversation or anything. You know, some preachers get up, tell a bunch of jokes before they start the message, and so I don't have any jokes for you tonight. And I could tell you a few things about Brother Eric, and but he's shaking his head, so he's not for that. And so, but I have known Brother Eric for a long time. Me and him's been really good friends. And it's amazing how God puts people in your life, and it just seems like that person helps build you, and you maybe help build them, and both of you get something from the relationship. And so I'm very grateful for that. And I don't know, it's probably been, I guess, 16 or 17 years now that we've known each other. And man, it's been great. The Lord has allowed us to do some things together. I had completely forgotten about the stuff on Friday nights that we used to go do. And so to say entertaining, it would be an understatement of some of the stuff that would happen when you'd go downtown Atlanta and you're out there preaching on the street, and there's other people getting into all kinds of sin. They're not really wanting to find a street preacher. And so I remember there being some interesting conversations go on. I remember one night we were across the street from the Hard Rock Cafe, and man, there's people everywhere. And I was standing on the street corner just passing out tracts. I wasn't preaching or anything, just standing there divvying out tracts. And this guy in a white car, he pulls up and parks his car just a few feet away and gets out of his car and comes over there and starts talking to me. And so I give him a tract, and I'm asking him about, the Lord, and we're talking, and me and him both are standing there, and the guy's listening. I mean, what's the odds of some guy just pulling over, getting out of his car, and wanting to talk to you about God? And so, but his car is about 30 feet from us, and we're standing there talking to each other, and we both look over, and there's a dude that has got his head inside that guy's car. And so immediately, as soon as that guy seen that, he just takes off running and jumps in his car and drove off. And so I never got to finish the conversation with him. But, I mean, it was all kinds of crazy stuff. You never knew what you was going to get into. A lot of people would just try to do things to instigate, trouble and stuff like that. So it was a real good time. We'd spend every Friday night doing that. And so it was a blessing. Now, sitting in classes 3 times a week was grueling. A lot of days, man, you'd work, back then I'd probably work 60, 70 hours a week and still going to class. And so my weekly routine, by the end of the week, I was spent. And so Jennifer, she would get upset because I'd come dragging in on Friday and she's ready to do something. And but anyway, 1 Corinthians chapter number 12 is where we'll get started at tonight. And so the title of the message is When the Manna Gets Old. And you're thinking, we're in 1 Corinthians 12, what's that got to do with manna? We'll get there in just a minute. And so, but in 1 Corinthians chapter number 12, and verse number 18, it says, But now hath God set the members, every one of them in the body, as it hath pleased Him. So the Lord has all set us in some places. And oftentimes we kind of take that for granted. And Brother Eric's talking about this one family getting transitioned from here, going to be transitioned somewhere else. And so we may look at that as an accident or whatever, but man, God sees a way bigger picture than what me and you can see. And so as He sets these things, if you could kind of think about it and kind of look at it as the fact, as a jeweler is setting diamonds in a ring, man, there's a very precise method done whenever they are setting those things in place. And Jennifer's got a ring from her grandmother, and that ring has got, each jewel is a different color. And one of the jewels fell out of that thing one time, and you would think it wouldn't really be that big of a deal, but it was very noticeable when that one little jewel was missing from that ring. And can I say tonight that the Lord, He has set us all in a place. And it's very important that we accept the place that He sets us. And the problem is sometimes we get too comfortable in that place and we never want to move anywhere else. And so, but God is very strategic in what He's doing. And so, just as a jeweler sets those stones, God has set us in a place. And the great thing about it is not only has He set us in a place, but we've also been supplied. And you find in Exodus chapter number 16, God starts feeding manna out in Exodus chapter number 16. And so God brought the children of Israel, He brought them out of Egypt. And they needed substance. And so God just literally started giving them manna. And so that manna was something fell from heaven. It was a great blessing from God. It was something they didn't have to work for, not nothing they ever had to earn. But it was just a provision that was constantly given out to them. But also the thing is we get over the provisions. I don't know about y'all, but food is readily available to me, and sometimes I have a hard time figuring out what I want to eat because there's so many things available. And sometimes you just get tired of the same old options. Like if you got any kids and you live near a Chick-fil-A, guess what what they want to eat all the time is Chick-fil-A. And so what do you not want to eat? You don't want no more Chick-fil-A. You've had enough. And so just like that with the children of Israel, they had been eating the manna and they got sick and tired of the manna. And so in Numbers chapter number 11, you find where they start talking about the manna. In Numbers 11 and verse number 4, it says, "And the mixed multitude that was among them fell lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? And it says, We remember the fish which we did eat freely, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, and the onions, and the garlics. And it says, But now our soul is dried away, and there is nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes." And let me ask you tonight, are you tired of what God's been giving you? I don't know about y'all, but sometimes when you're dealing with your kids, you feel like, how could you be any more ungrateful? You know, you get all these good things, and sometimes they complain over things, and you think, man, people would kill to have some of the opportunities you have. And the children of Israel, literally, they didn't have to grow crops. They wouldn't have to work a field. They literally just went out in the morning and gathered their meal. And it was almost like fast food. You just swing outside the tent, grab what you need, and go back in. And but they got tired of the provision that God had been giving them. And can I say to you that if you're tired of what God's been giving you, it might be because you got too comfortable in the place you're in. Because whenever God brought them out of Israel, God's plan was not to feed them on manna the rest of their life. That wasn't His plan. But we have a gracious and we have a kind God. In Hebrews chapter number 5 and verse number 12 it says, "For when the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need of one that teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat." And so oftentimes we have a desire for something, and we feel like God is being unjust by not giving it to us. But at the same time, God wants to give it to us. God's already made provision to give it to us, but we hadn't been willing to trust Him to have it. And so the children of Israel, they eat on that manna for 40 years. And that was not God's plan at all. But God will provide provision outside of obedience. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm extremely grateful for that God, every time I step outside of what God wants me to do, He doesn't just cut the provision off. The children of Israel, God wanted them in Canaan land. That's where God wanted them at. He did not want them to spend 40 years living in the desert eating on manna. That wasn't God's plan. But God made provision for their disobedience. And so He continued to feed them. He continued to take care of them. In Nehemiah chapter number 9 and verse number 21, it says, "Yea, 40 years did thou sustain them in the wilderness, so they lacked nothing. Their clothes waxed not old, and their feet swelled not." So for 40 years, these people, they didn't have to make any more clothes. Their feet didn't swell. God provided for them 40 years when they were in a place that wasn't where He really wanted them. And so I want to encourage you in the fact tonight that God's got a place for us spiritually. And if your Christian life seems dull and mundane, and if being a Christian just doesn't seem to be that great to you, then there's a good chance that you're still eating manna when God got something else for you. And so the manna was intended to be used, but it was only intended to be temporary because God had greater things available for him, much greater. I apologize about my voice, but there's nothing I can do about that. I guess it's a way to keep you humble, huh? So, but if you look at Joshua chapter number 1, I want you to notice something in Joshua chapter number 1. The Lord set them in a place, and the Lord gave them provisions, but He had success for them. Now, He had already set up success for these people 40 years before they received it. He had already made preparation for the success 40 years in advance. So that means the success was available the whole time. The whole time they're complaining about eating manna, it wasn't God's fault, it was their fault. If your Christian life is dry and dull and boring, can I tell you tonight that it's not God's fault, it's our fault. Because that's not the way God designed the Christian life to be. That's not what He set it up for. God designed it to be something great, and God designed it to be something that the world would say, man, that's amazing, and we want it. But so many Christians are backwards. They're looking at the world saying we want what they've got. It's so distorted. Joshua chapter number 1:8, it says, but this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, and thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein, and then shalt thou make thy way prosperous, and then shalt thou have good success. So the key here was what? To meditate therein, day and night, in the law. And if they would have been willing to meditate on those things, then God's saying, I would give you good success. But see, they had their mind on the wrong things. Whenever those 12 spies went, 10 of them had their mind on meditating on God. 2 of them did, and the other 10, they had their mind on the world. And they were focused on seeing what was in the world. A lot of churches, they act like they're defeated today and act like we can't have revival because they're looking at the world instead of looking at the God that we serve. I don't know about y'all, I've had God do such great things in my life that I can believe anything is possible. Because God has done, I've been able to experience some things in my life with Him, and so it causes me to trust Him to be able to do something more. But see, these 10 spies, they didn't have that. And so in Numbers chapter number 13 and verse 27, it says, and they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sentest, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. So they went over there to spy out the land, and God has said, this is the land that I want you to have, and this land has got everything. Not only does it have a beautiful land, but this was God's intentions that those people would work that land and prepare that land so that it would be ready for the children of Israel when they took the land. And so God had worked out the whole plan for them. But in chapter number 14 and verse number 8 it says, if the Lord delight in us, then He will bring us into this land and give it to us. And the land floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel ye not against the Lord, neither fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. It says their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us, fear them not. But all the congregation bade stone them with stones, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation before all the children of Israel. So the 2 guys that said, hey man, the land is plenteous. The land is good for us, and God has given us this land. Everybody else is ready to kill those 2 guys now. It's interesting in church, the people that are actually doing something are normally the ones getting criticized. Because they see something that God has showed them that's possible that everybody else thinks not possible. I'm just going to go on an assumption, and I don't know, but I imagine when y'all just started discussing building a new building, I'm sure there was probably some people that complained about that. But see, God is willing to do much greater things than we can see or think. I mean, if you would have told me that God was going to do some of the things that He's done in my life, there's no way I would have ever believed it. No way I'd ever believed it. But because how great our God is, those things have happened. And so Caleb and Joshua, they saw their God bigger than the giants, while all the other spies saw the giants bigger than God. And so how are you looking at your issues, and how are you looking at your seat tonight? Are you tired of the manna? Here's some really interesting stuff to me that I thought whenever I was reading this. They crossed the Red Sea in 1491. Now, that's not AD, that's BC. And so they crossed the Red Sea in 1491, and then they didn't enter Jericho until 1451. So that's roughly 40 years later. So here's the interesting thing. In Joshua chapter number 2, if you want to turn there, you can. We're going to read a few verses. In Joshua chapter number 2, these guys encounter a young lady named Rahab. Brother Eric mentioned her this morning. Now, according to what I read and studied, it says that Rahab was 20 years old whenever those spies come into the land. And so in Joshua chapter number 2, it's saying that Rahab was about 20 years old. But now, I want you to look in Joshua chapter number 2 and verse number 9 and hear what she had to say. A lady 20 years old. That means she wasn't alive whenever they crossed the Red Sea. In Joshua chapter number 2 and verse number 9, it says, "And she said unto them, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you." This is a 20-year-old young lady talking about something that happened 40 years ago. You realize God melted the hearts of those inhabitants 40 years before they got the land. God had already set the victory in place 40 years before they received the victory. It's kind of like this. Jesus Christ made the way of salvation available 2,000 years ago. And there's still people getting in on it today, 2,000 years later. And guess what? It's been available the whole 2,000 years. So He has already made preparation for something that people don't necessarily get whenever the preparation was made. It's only when they finally see Him for who He is do they finally receive that victory. And so in our Christian life, it's much the same way that God has already done great works in our life, but because we see the enemy bigger than Him, we don't realize the victory's already been given. And it's already been taken care of. And so look, it says, when you came out of Egypt and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, and that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon, Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in any man. Now, I want you to notice this. This is a military town. I'm assuming there's quite a few of y'all that's either been in or is out now. But somebody that goes into battle without any courage, what's their chances of winning? Do you want that person in a foxhole with you? No. Because they're going to tuck tail and run. And so God had taken and melted the enemy's heart and taken their courage away from them 40 years. Those people had been without courage and without heart for 40 years. And God had already made preparation for children of Israel. But they didn't see the victory because it wasn't already handed to them. See, a lot of us is waiting on God to throw something in our lap. When every instance I found in the Bible, first we must take a step out before He pours a blessing out. Whenever the priest was carrying the Ark of the Covenant into the Jordan River, they had to step off in the Jordan River before He parted the water. Whenever the children of Israel would go out into battle, God oftentimes would give them the battle, but they first had to be willing to go out. And so These men of Jericho, they had no heart, they had no courage. It had all been stripped away 40 years prior. And so for 40 years, the children of Israel complained about eating manna, and they talked about the leeks and the garlics and all those things that they wanted to eat that were all hanging on the trees in Canaan land. They were waiting to be plucked. And God had already prepared them and had them ready for them. And some of those people never got those benefits. If you remember, God said, you know what, I'm so done with some of y'all, we're going to stay out here till you die now. And I hate to say it, but it seems that a lot of Christians in life today never make it to Canaan land spiritually. They die in the wilderness when God has already made the provisions for them. God had so much more available to them, and they missed out on it. But see, Joshua and Caleb here, they both got to reap the benefits of what God had for them because they seen their God bigger than their enemies. Whenever Caleb finally got to the land, he was 85, and he talked about how his strength was still as if he was 40, and he said, I want that mountain. I want that place that God prepared for me. And I want to ask you tonight, are you going after anything that God's prepared for you? I promise you, God has made preparations. God has done mighty works, but oftentimes we can't see until we get up and start moving. And we're guilty, and none of us likes to fail. None of us likes conflict. And so we're so guilty of wanting God to open all the doors up first. And we say, God, if you'll just open all these doors up first, I'll walk through them then. But see, God expects us to do something first. And so, Brother Eric, you can come on if you want. And we'll close this out. I won't drag it out any at all. But Israel's enemies, they were defeated in their heart 40 years. And so, I don't know what enemies you're facing in life, and I don't know what battles you're facing in life, but there's a good chance that God's already been doing something on the other side, and God's just waiting on you to make your move. God may already have the garlics and the leeks and all that stuff already planted, and they're already blooming and they're already growing. The cattle's already lowing in the fields, and we're just not doing our part and getting out and moving first. And so I want to encourage you tonight, if your Christian life seems a little dull, seems a little dry, if you're tired of chewing on the manna and you want something different to eat on, can I encourage you to step a little farther out with God? I couldn't get over the fact that Rahab was only 20 years old, and when she told that story, you would have thought that she saw them cross the Red Sea. That's how impactful those stories had been, was it affected even the next generation. And I'm telling you, man, God has not lost any of His power. And just like God got the victory over salvation for each and every one of us, and for me, I was 9 years old before I received that victory of salvation. Brother Eric was a grown man before he received that victory of salvation. And God has got some victory in your Christian life. God's got a Canaan land for you. But it's up to you whether or not you ever make it there.
Praise the Lord. I was thinking if you can come get us a song to play for prayer. But I was thinking about that. I thought, one of the things they looked at, they were looking at the enemy and saw the enemy bigger than God. That was one thing. But then the other thing they kept looking at was they were looking back at Egypt and thought that the provisions that they wanted, the leeks and the garlic were back there. But I didn't even thought about it until he was saying that a while ago. God had already dealt with the big enemy that they were looking at and already had something better than the leeks and the garlics prepared for them. The problem was they just weren't stepping into it. And so there are some things, like he's saying, in our lives that God has really done in our lives for us. We're just not seizing them, and we're just kind of walking in a circle and complaining about God. And that's what ends up happening. You know what they did over and over again in that wilderness journey is they complained and murmured and complained and murmured and complained and murmured at everything God was doing in their life. And I think a lot of people get to the place where they just spend their Christian life complaining and murmuring instead of really walking in the great things God's got for their life. And it's already been, that's what's so good about it, it's already been done for you. I just talked to someone